Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. We are meeting today to hear testimony on NOAA's report on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps keep members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. The oceans are truly the final frontier, the wild west of our planet, you might say, the remoteness of the open ocean, combined with the limited data and the monitoring of fishing vessels and a lack of law enforcement capabilities, create a perfect storm for illegal activity. Today we're here to discuss NOAA's 2019 report to Congress on illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, which was, this report was released in September. Reducing IUU fishing is critically important. It's important for the health of our oceans to ensure fish stocks aren't fished beyond the point of recovery. It's important for human safety and well-being, as IUU fishing is often coupled with other illegal and abhorrent practices such as human trafficking and slavery. And it's important for the well-being of our own domestic fishermen, who fish in some of the best managed fisheries in the world, yet compete in a market with imported fish that may have been caught using forced labor and illegal fishing practices. NOAA is charged with identifying countries engaged in IUU fishing and working with those countries to improve their fishing management and enforcement practices. NOAA then certifies whether the actions by those countries have adequately addressed the illegal activity and then reports these findings to Congress every 2 years. We appreciate the work that NOAA is doing to identify IUU fishing and to collaborate with other countries on improvements. I'd like to use this hearing, though, to outline some ways that we think NOAA can improve the process and how Congress can help by providing more robust authority for them to do so. In its report, NOAA identified 3 countries as engaging in IUU fishing, including Ecuador and Mexico. The problem is that of the 3 identified countries, Ecuador and Mexico received a positive certification for taking corrective actions on past violations while simultaneously being re-identified for new violations. This pattern of positive certifications for repeat offenders has persisted over the last 10 years, and it suggests that the certification system is not effectively discouraging new violations. So how can we ensure that we're adequately identifying the scope of countries engaging in IUU fishing? And how can we better discourage IUU fishing? For starters, we believe NOAA's definition of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is far narrower than the internationally agreed upon definitions used by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO. The FAO's definition includes fishing activities in violation of national and international laws, which could include forced labor, human trafficking, money laundering. These are all problems associated with IUU fishing, which you will hear more about from some of today's witnesses. Adopting the FAO's internationally agreed upon definition for IUU fishing would provide the U.S. with the ability to identify additional countries, like China, which is widely known to engage in IUU fishing and yet could not be identified on the basis of NOAA's more narrow definition. Now, in addition to broadening the definition, NOAA could better identify countries engaging in IUU fishing by broadening the scope of information used for identification. And the sources that NOAA uses already are valuable, but the agency should consider using information on how much other countries subsidize overcapacity and overfishing, known violations and noncompliance with NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, and a detailed analysis of forced labor and human trafficking in the fishing and seafood sectors, since the links are well known. NOAA, to its credit, describes this problem in the report. Now, lastly, NOAA's certification criteria should be reevaluated. NOAA and the State Department take great lengths to work with other countries on implementing corrective actions. However, NOAA only positively certifies a country for taking action and not for the results of those actions. And that's why countries like Mexico and Ecuador are passing through a constant revolving door of identification, positive certification, and then re-identification for the very same actions. Aside from NOAA's work, we should be leveraging trade agreements to deter IUU fishing. The U.S. could impose stronger and more meaningful sanctions against negatively certified nations, such as limiting imports from entire countries engaged in IUU fishing, rather than just from specific vessels. Imports of illegally caught fish don't just hurt the environment, they hurt American fishermen and businesses who compete in the marketplace against dirty, unfairly valued products. As we work towards renegotiating NAFTA, we need to use this opportunity to strengthen the environmental provisions of the trade agreement to address issues like IUU fishing. We need a better picture of IUU fishing occurring in our oceans and a better way of working with other countries to make sure our fishermen are getting a fair chance and to make sure we're keeping our oceans healthy. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about their ideas and what they've observed in their own careers about this topic, and I'll now turn it over to the ranking member for his comments.
Yes, and if only we had the USMCA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to hear testimony on NOAA's report to Congress on improving international fisheries management. To be clear, this report has nothing to do with American fisheries, which are among the most sustainable and well-regulated in the world. It's a report on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in other countries. These types of fishing activities undermine management efforts and the efforts of responsible fishermen, which is why Congress has passed several bills that have increased our engagement on these issues. It's often claimed that 90% of seafood consumed in the United States is imported, implying only 10% is of domestic origin. In fact, according to NOAA's 2017 Fisheries of the United States report, Americans consumed 5.2 million pounds of seafood, while American fishermen landed 8.2 million pounds. The American fishing industry produces far more than Americans consume. The difference is that we export much of our production and import the balance. Once again, the American fishing industry is the hero of this story, complying with responsible, sustainable practices while successfully competing internationally. The problem is that other nations do not, and we run afoul of the tragedy of the commons on the high seas. When nobody owns a resource, nobody has an incentive to sustain it, and everybody has a perverse incentive to deplete it. The United States has taken a leading role in addressing this condition by using several legal and policy tools to address illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This includes denying illegal fishermen access to American markets. Without this, illegal fishermen are operating in an environment where the monetary reward of illegal fishing far outweighs the risks. We work with other fishing nations to strengthen enforcement and data collection programs aimed at reducing illegal fishing around the world. While actions taken by some foreign fishing fleets are abhorrent, such as those we will hear about today, the simple truth is we don't control these sovereign countries. The best way for us to combat these nations' actions is to support our domestic fishing industry that is the undisputed best in the world. However, we have seen in this committee time and again efforts by the Democrats to devastate the U.S. fishing industry. Look no further than H.R. 737 or H.R. 1979, which would all but eliminate sustainable, law-abiding U.S. fisheries. Our options are limited in trying to control foreign industries, but we have the tools and the obligation to support America's workers. We can do that by assuring that U.S. markets are closed to these bad actors without punishing the American fishing industry that is not only blameless, but has been exemplary in adhering to sustainable practices. There's also much more that we can and should be doing to expand the role of fish hatcheries and aquaculture in producing fish products to meet the needs of our society. The moment that we can produce these products more cheaply in captivity than we can catch them in the wild, the sooner the bane of unsustainable fishing will naturally disappear. I expect we will hear demands today to expand the U.S. seafood import monitoring program to include all consumed fish species. Given that this program was only implemented last year and is still in its infancy, I would suggest that we first listen to the U.S. fishing industry to work out burdens that it is needlessly imposing on Americans. That is the problem with regulatory enactments. There is no accountability to the people actually impacted by them, and that's why our Constitution vests all legislative power in the Congress. This is where these laws should be enacted. after listening carefully to those in the real world who must deal with them. If the Seafood Import Monitoring Program had been enacted by statute with members of Congress accountable to those they were burdening, I doubt we would be hearing the complaints today that its provisions needlessly impose $53 million a year in record-keeping alone on American fishermen who are not the problem. I look forward to hearing today from the administration and the industry on how successful U.S. fisheries management has been and how we as Congress can advance policies that protect responsible Americans in the industry while denying markets to the irresponsible foreign actors that our fishermen must compete against in a global market. With that, I yield back.
I will now briefly introduce our witness from the administration. Ms. Alexa Cole is the Director of International Affairs and Seafood Inspection for NOAA Fisheries. Ms. Cole, we're happy to have you join us today and offer some clarity on the administration views. As a reminder, under our committee rules, witnesses are asked to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will appear in the hearing record. And when you begin, the light in front of you will be green. When it turns yellow, that means there's 1 minute left, and you know what the red light means. It's time to wrap it up. With that, I now recognize Ms. Cole. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you very much. Chair and members of the subcommittee, my name is Alexa Cole, and I am the Director of NOAA Fisheries Office of International Affairs and Seafood Inspection. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on our 2019 Improving International Fisheries Management report to Congress. This congressionally directed report is issued every 2 years. We develop the report by analyzing information from the past 3 years on IUU fishing, bycatch of protected living marine resources, and shark catch on the high seas. Based on that information, we go through a 3-step process: identification, consultation with the identified countries, and certification based on whether corrective action has occurred. After identification, we consult with the country to ensure that it is taking actions to address the issue. After a 2-year consultation, we issue either a positive or a negative certification. To receive a positive certification, nations identified as having vessels engaged in bycatch and/or shark catch on the high seas must both adopt a regulatory program comparable in effectiveness to that of the United States and adopt a management plan which will assist in the collection of species-specific information. Nations identified for IUU fishing must provide documentation that they have taken appropriate corrective action. Nations that do not meet these standards will receive a negative certification. Vessels of nations that receive a negative certification are subject to denial of U.S. port access and port privileges. In addition, certain fish and fish products of the nation derived from the activities that led to the identification may be subject to U.S. import restrictions. In this report, the 3 nations identified in 2017, the Russian Federation, Mexico, and Ecuador, took sufficient corrective action to receive a positive certification. However, we again identified Mexico and Ecuador for IUU fishing activities that occurred in 2016 to 2018. The Republic of Korea was also identified. Mexico was identified in 2015 and 2017 for having small vessels known as lanchas fishing illegally in the U.S. EEZ. Illegal fishing by lanchas has been a chronic problem for several decades, despite widespread U.S. enforcement and diplomatic efforts. After its 2015 identification, Mexico began to make some efforts to control these activities for the first time. However, in 2017, Mexico initially received a negative certification, but once it provided documentation that it had begun to prosecute these lancha cases, it was positively certified. While progress has been made, it is clear that Mexico's efforts have not put an end to these incursions, and so Mexico has been identified again. When making our 2021 certifications, we will focus on whether we are seeing significant reductions in the number of incursions and the number of repeat offenders found fishing illegally in U.S. waters. In the 2017 report, Ecuador was identified for having vessels that violated Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission measures. Ecuador addressed these issues and received a positive certification in 2019. However, we have identified Ecuador again for new alleged violations of IATTC measures. Ecuador's failure to address allegations of noncompliance by its purse seine fleet is concerning, since it comprises approximately 40% of the total number of currently authorized purse seine vessels in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. The 2019 report identifies the Republic of Korea for failing to have the necessary legal authorities to deter its vessels from violating measures adopted by the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Living Marine Resources. While China was not identified, there were numerous incidents of alleged IUU fishing activities in the waters of other nations by Chinese-flagged vessels. These activities do not fall within the definition of the Act's regulatory definition of IUU fishing, so could not lead to an identification. However, the number of alleged incidents and the broad geographic scope necessitated inclusion in the report. In 2015, Congress extended the time frame of information considered for bycatch identification from 1 to 3 years. Unfortunately, the majority of bycatch data are not publicly reported, and any reported data is not available for several years. As a result, bycatch identifications remain challenging. The 2019 report was the first time we were able to consider 3 years of shark data on the high seas. However, RFMO data lags by 1 year, so shark catch data was only available for 2016 and 2017. There continues to be critical data gaps, particularly in the species of shark caught and the location of the catch. Severe labor rights abuses and exploitation on board fishing vessels has led to greater international attention. While these issues are beyond the scope of the report, they warrant attention by fishery managers and other appropriate bodies. NOAA will continue to engage with our interagency partners and work collectively to address these important issues. The Moratorium Protection Act is one of many important tools we use to address IUU fishing and the bycatch of protected living marine resources. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Cole, we'll now take it to the members, and I'll recognize the members each for 5 minutes, alternating between the majority and the minority, starting with recognizing myself. So, Ms. Cole, from 2016 to 2018, Mexico, as you mentioned, was identified for reported IUU fishing activities. That included activities in U.S. waters involving red snapper. And I'm sorry that Mr. Graves is not here, but Mr. Graves loves to talk about red snapper. And he's pointed out time and time again in this committee how important economically they are to the Gulf of Mexico communities that he represents. What was most concerning for me in the 2019 IUU report is that the U.S. imported over 10.5 million pounds of fresh and frozen red snapper from Mexico with a declared value of $33 million. U.S. fishermen should not be losing access and economic opportunity due to IUU fishing by other countries in our own waters. It's like they're taking our lunch money. So I want to ask you, do we have a clear idea of what portion of the United States Mexican seafood imports are the product of IUU fishing?
Thank you for the question. As you are probably aware, the vessels that we are talking about that are fishing illegally in U.S. waters are very small, what are called lancha vessels. And as a result, they are not subject to as much reporting and record keeping as larger commercial vessels might be. So it is very difficult to estimate accurately what percentage of catch from those vessels might be related to import into the United States. It's sort of impossible to have good numbers.
What would it take to get that kind of visibility?
It would certainly take help from the Mexican government. As you know, this has been a chronic problem with Mexico for decades, and we are pleased that this report to Congress and identification of Mexico has started to show progress on the issue. While it may not seem that it's enough yet, it is a big step that Mexico is finally taking some responsibility for these cases and starting to prosecute themselves.
Any other thoughts on what we can do to protect our domestic fishermen from IUU fishing operations? And specifically, what do we need to do to build greater enforcement capacity, including in Mexico?
Obviously, the Moratorium Protection Act is one tool that we have, and we have many others. There is no one single tool that is going to resolve the problem of IUU fishing or the potential to import fish that was caught illegally. But when we take all of the tools together, we're beginning to see progress. We engage in broad scope of capacity building around the world, whereas we're teaching other countries how to take enforcement actions, how to implement the Port State Measures Agreement. We have, as you noted, the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, which allows us to have greater information about the imports coming into the United States. These are all tools that, taken together, are going to have a collective effect and have been having a collective effect on keeping illegal fish out of the U.S. market.
What about the renegotiation of NAFTA or the USMCA? What kind of opportunities does that present to address the need for better fishing cooperation on this and other environmental issues?
So the negotiations of NAFTA and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is really not in the scope of NOAA's portfolio. I would defer most questions on that to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. NOAA does engage with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative as a subject matter expert, and we have been engaged in working on the environment chapter that have provisions related to IUU fishing. And we
Have you been making them aware of this problem?
USTR?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, we have.
All right. I think that's important because we seem to find Mexico in a revolving door of being identified and then making promises for action and then being recertified only to be re-identified for the same abuses. And at some point, it seems like NOAA is going to have to take more corrective action. Obviously, this revolving door is not achieving the kind of change that we need to see. So I urge you to continue to communicate that need to the U.S. Trade Representative. We'll hope that we can have some kind of a conversation with them and find out how they are trying to use this trade agreement as an opportunity to address this problem. I think with that, I will yield, and we will go to Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock, for holding this important hearing. Thank you to both panels for coming here today, and especially thank you to Ms. Cole for coming to my office in September to brief my staff on international fishing treaties. So when it comes to fisheries, bad actors threaten our fishing industry at multiple levels, whether that be catching, importing, labeling, etc. However, I'd like to take a brief moment and acknowledge that we should be proud of the work done so far. The United States serves as an example to all other countries when it comes to healthy and sustainable fisheries. Eliminating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing will always remain a priority for this country, and I hope we can continue to protect both our environment and the interests of American fishermen. Ms. Cole, in the last several reports to Congress, NOAA identified countries which engaged in IUU fishing, and many of those countries were identified multiple times over the past 8 years. Your written testimony covers some of the work NOAA has done to work with countries to correct this behavior, and that's undoubtedly something to commend you for. However, could you provide some insight in how you address countries who are home to multiple violations over long periods? Are countries repeating the same violations each time after consulting with NOAA, or are they actually dealing with new issues that crop up after solving each instance? To put it another way, is the international community making progress, or are we doing the heavy lifting? And how do you usually deal with repeat offenders?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, for the question. I think a good example of the type of progress that we're seeing is Korea. Korea has been identified several times, and in the times that we have been working with them, we have seen Korea adopt new laws that provide them with greater enforcement authorities. We have seen them adopt the implementation of vessel monitoring systems on their entire distant water fishing nation. We have seen them engage much more productively in the international multilateral organizations. They are taking leadership roles in those organizations and working productively with the United States. So all of these, while I recognize that progress doesn't ever come as fast as we hope that it will, but we are seeing steady progress with those countries that have been identified previously and are identified again. Thank you.
So, Ms. Cole, you're here today representing NOAA, but could you speak to some of what is being done across other executive agencies, such as USDA, DOS, etc., to address illegal fish making its way into our industry? I understand that the question may be a bit broad, so just speak to what you know. A large part of the issue we are covering today involves our relationship with other countries, so at the very least, perhaps you could speak to NOAA's relationship with the State Department on this very thing.
Thank you. We work very closely with the State Department and with U.S. Trade Representative and with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other agencies to try to address these issues on a multilateral basis. There are many different fronts that we have to look at this issue, and we've talked about some of them already in terms of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, where we work closely with FDA and other organizations in terms of information about the product that's coming into the United States. The State Department and NOAA engage bilaterally with countries around the world and multilaterally through our works in the Regional Fishery Management Organization, our work at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, to negotiate and work closely to bring other countries up to the standards that we have here in the United States. We're focused on leveling the playing field for U.S. fishers so that they are working in the same fair playing field as vessels from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. Ms. Cole, welcome. Ms. Cole, sharks are explicitly named under all three prongs of the Moratorium Protection Act, including in the definitions of IUU fishing and protected living marine resources, and under the pathway directing the Secretary to identify nations whose vessels have fished for sharks on the high seas. Moreover, in 2016, Congress amended the law to extend the look-back period for identifications based on the Act's shark fishing provisions and bycatch provisions from 1 year to 3 years. But despite the clear priority that Congress has placed on using the Act to conserve sharks, the agency has almost never identified or certified any nation for shark-related violation. Why is this?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. One of the challenges that we have had in terms of shark identifications is the fact that we do not have good data coming out of the regional fishery management organizations that are specific enough to the species that's been caught and the location of the catch. The statute specifies that the catch of shark has to be on the high seas in order for it to be eligible for identification under the statute. And without that kind of detailed information, it makes it very challenging for us to be able to take consistent and fair measures in terms of our identifications. In addition, the statute also directs us to work closely with our multilateral partners, and we have been doing that. We have been working at all of the regional fishery management organizations to which the United States is a party to adopt strong conservation and management measures related to sharks. We've been doing that in the Pacific, in both the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission and the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, and as well as in the Atlantic at the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, to try to adopt strong measures to get better data to address the issue of shark
reclaiming my time, Ms. Cole, you're saying that it is just not possible to identify sharks caught in the high seas.
I'm saying that it has been difficult to do it in a consistent, fair, and transparent manner, which is why we have focused our efforts multilaterally.
So it's difficult, but it's possible. And so that means that NOAA has actually found vessels with sharks on them, with shark catches.
So we have information where there is some data on vessels with shark catch.
Okay, then I'll go to so Congress has made clear it's zero tolerance for IUU fishing, amending the law a few years ago to clarify that IUU fishing by even a single vessel requires NIMF to identify and list the nation. The Regional Fisheries Management Organization, RFMO compliance reports alone, to which NIMF has ample access as a recent chair of the compliance committee for 3 of the tuna RFMOs, provides substantial evidence of IUU shark fishing by many vessels with some systematic problems among certain nations. Why then, Ms. Cole, why then has the agency failed to identify a single nation for IUU shark fishing violations despite substantial evidence of IUU shark fishing by many vessels?
So then NOAA has not identified incidents where there was illegal fishing that occurred that would subject them to the IUU fishing identification provision where corrective action had not already been taken by either the flag or the coastal state. There are situations where we have some data relating to shark catch on the high seas. However, we want to avoid creating a system whereby we punish those countries who have in fact provided the necessary amount of data, creating a disincentive for other countries who have not yet provided that data to get that data to the RFMOs.
So if you say that if I am caught speeding, I shouldn't get a ticket so that others may not be encouraged to to drive past the speed limit. You're saying that you've caught vessels with sharks, but that you do not want to disrupt their harmony relationship between NOAA and those vessels or those countries, despite the law. Is that what you're telling me?
No, I think what I'm telling you is trying to suggest that what's more important is that we get the relevant data related to shark catch.
And you have
so we
relative
can-
data that says sharks have been caught. And you have not listed those nations despite the requirement by law. Very explicit. Mr. Chairman, my time is. Ms. Cole, please, do your job. Are you back?
Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Ms. Cole. First off, has NOAA done any analysis on the costs that are borne by American businesses in complying with the seafood import monitoring program?
Yes, sir. Some of that analysis was done in preparing the regulatory action that we put forward, and so we did that in the proposed rule, and it's
And
available.
how much is it?
I don't have the numbers to hand with me today,
$2
sir.
million a year, is that ballpark?
I can't speak to the numbers. I don't have them to hand.
I'd like to get those numbers and see what, what is frustrating is our folks aren't the problem. And yet they are bearing significant costs because of this program, because I don't think that they were adequately consulted as these regulations were developed.
I would happily take that question for the record and get back to you with those numbers, sir.
Let me ask you this. We hear calls of expanding the seafood import monitoring system to include all species and fish products imported in the United States. The initial recommendations from the IUU task force called for a risk-based program. During your testimony, you described the program as risk-based. I don't see what's risk-based about a blanket expansion to all species, regardless of merit.
Thank you for the question. At the moment, NOAA has no intention of expanding the program. We have no current plans to expand it. We are really focused on it as a risk-based program, focused on the priority species that we identified, the 13 species that we found to be most at risk for IUU fishing and seafood fraud. As you noted, we're in the early days of the program, and we are working on effective implementation for those key species to ensure that it serves as a proper deterrent to bring any illegal product into the United States for those species.
So at this point, NOAA would not support the expansion of SIMP to include all species?
At this point, NOAA has no plans to expand the program to all species.
Obviously, fisheries management is the principal objective of the program, but there are also issues involving foreign forced labor, money laundering. Does NOAA have the expertise to regulate and enforce these labor and financial issues?
Those issues are beyond NOAA's typical scope and mandate. We work very closely with fellow agencies who have more expertise on issues related to forced labor to ensure that we can take a whole of government approach to these concerns.
I'm told that NOAA has conducted roughly 1,000 audits of seafood companies subject to the SIMP.
I think that's around the right number, sir.
And how many of those have resulted in discrepancies?
I think the number of that we found that are approximately, I think it's 65%, but I can be sure to get you the exact number for the record that have been found to be fully compliant in terms
Fully
of record.
compliant, but is it accurate to say about 50 have been, you've noted discrepancies that required further investigation?
I don't have the exact number that have required additional investigation. When the auditors find potential issues, they look at it, and if they think there's a potential violation, those are forwarded to the Office of Law Enforcement, and many of those investigations may be ongoing, and I can't.
And how many of those have actually resulted in action by the Office of Law Enforcement?
As it's a new program, the Office of Law Enforcement has been engaging in enforcement in what we usually do, which is a staged approach, starting with outreach and education, moving through written warnings, and then summary settlement tickets, and then eventually civil penalties. I believe there have been some that have received some written warnings and summary settlement penalties, but I'm not aware of the exact numbers. We could get those.
Have any been assessed civil penalties?
They have been assessed summary settlement penalties, which are a form of civil penalty.
See. The only other concern I have is the tragedy of the commons, which this is really all about. It seems to me that ultimately we're not going to be able to address that in the kind of global marketplace we have today. It seems to me that the best way to deal with it is to bring down the cost of aquaculture and hatchery fish. What's NOAA doing along these lines?
Well, aquaculture is beyond the scope of what I'm really prepared to talk about today, but NOAA is certainly committed to aquaculture and has been doing a lot of work domestically to engage, as well as talking to international partners to learn from them and learn how they have been developing their aquaculture programs.
As I said in my opening comments, the moment that the cost of seafood bred in captivity drops below the cost of harvesting it in the wild, this problem goes away, does it not?
I don't know that I can answer that so definitively, sir.
Some of it. The chair recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Cole, could you help me understand a little bit more your comments on China? Identified instances of possible violations, but could not find a violation because of the definitional parts of the law. So what's that all about? What's the deficiency in the definition, and would NOAA advocate for correcting the definition?
Thank you, sir. So the definition for IUU fishing under the regulations implementing this provision of the statute does not include situations where there has been an incursion by a foreign fishing vessel into the exclusive economic zone of another country and have been caught fishing illegally there. It is focused on high seas or in violation of a conservation and management measure of a regional fishery management organization. And so for that reason, we were not able to specifically identify China, but because of the widespread nature of the allegations that we were seeing, we felt it was important to include them in the report. As for a change to the rulemaking, we are at this moment contemplating a change to the rulemaking that would include activities where we see a pattern of illegal activity by one country's vessels in the EEZs of one or more other countries.
And these incursions, are you saying that these are unauthorized fishing in another country's EEZ, or is it is it under a lease from another country of its EEZ, as China is busy pursuing in the Pacific right now?
I think that there was a mixture in terms of the allegations. Some of them were incursions that were unauthorized. They did not have any license to fish. There may have been some incidences as well that were related to countries where those vessels were authorized to fish, but they had fished in violation of those authorizations. In terms of the changes that we're thinking about making to the regulation, we're focused really on the first, where they are not authorized to fish in that country's water.
So those regulations would be in concurrence with those jurisdictions where the unauthorized incursions are occurring, in other words?
In terms of being able to use that changed definition for identification purposes, we would certainly consult with those countries
Right.
in whose waters the violations occur.
And can you accomplish this by regulation, or do you need statutory amendment?
We can accomplish it by regulation. The statute says that the IUU fishing definition has to include, at a minimum, 3 elements, and as through regulation, we can expand the definition, and we have already. And so we could do that simply through regulation.
Yeah, well, I would certainly encourage you to go in this direction, because as you know very well, when you take a look at the size of those EEZs out there, especially in the Pacific, and add them all up, actually you're talking about an incredible amount of the Pacific Ocean, which which gets away a little bit from the tragedy of the commons, which is a tragedy, but we're not talking about the commons, we're talking about EEZs here, so it's all interrelated. And then just quickly on Russia, it would seem to be a good story that Russia was identified and then, worked with us, and 2 years later, Russia was in compliance. At least that's what I took away from it. And if that is the case, then I'm puzzled by why that happened, because, the good story would be Russia realized that they had the illegal fishing and decided to bring it all into compliance. But maybe the story is also that we have enforcement mechanisms that actually work in the case of Russia that we could then use more effectively in other areas where our enforcement is what the real problem is.
So I can't speak entirely to what motivated Russia to act in this case, but I would say that it was a combination of the identification under the Moratorium Protection Act and the fact that they were engaged in fishing that was in violation of the conservation, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Marine Resources, and at CAMLAR, which is that organization, there was multilateral pressure put on Russia for the identification of their vessels. And so I think there was this combination of both the bilateral engagement with the United States and the multilateral pressures that can come through the Regional Fishery Management Organization that helped to bring corrective action in this case.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, can I talk about ghost gear with you? Fishing nets illegally dumped overseas in the open oceans, and they are just as much a threat to the marine environment as illegal fishing because they have the same consequence, the depletion of the resource. Would you consider that it would be a good idea to include practices as to illegal dumping of ghost gear into the ocean with the same range of sanctions?
So that's an issue that we have certainly been engaged on through some of the international organizations, such as the International Maritime Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization. It is challenging to find ways to properly define the gear in a way that doesn't seem like other fishing gear, but it is certainly one that the agency has been addressing and is focused on. So we're working to engage on that issue.
Okay, there are or will be bills proposing a similar model for the addressing of ghost gear. Thank
I'd
you.
be happy to work on that with you.
Appreciate that.
Good promotional opportunity for your forthcoming bill there, Mr. Case. We'll look forward to
The
that.
Senate is doing it too, so not just me.
Excellent. I don't know if the other committee members want to go all the way through a second round of questions, but I do have a couple more questions for you, so it'll be up to the members to decide how far into this round we go, Ms. Cole. I wanted to ask you about the fact that, let me check and see if Mr. Grijalva has none. Okay. I'm sorry? Ms. Cole, I want to ask you about how the NOAA report doesn't provide...
Reserve a point of order.
You can reserve the point of order. Doesn't provide any detail about whether certain species of seafood from certain countries imported into the U.S. might be problematic, and whether those specific species might have a higher probability of being associated with IUU fishing and with other illegal and unethical practices that we're concerned about. So I want to ask whether NOAA has conducted any kind of species-specific analysis of this sort.
Thank you. We did when we were developing the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. The 13 species that we identified through that program were those species that we found to be most at risk of IUU fishing or seafood fraud. And we did that through an interagency process. We set forward a number of principles, which we put out in a Federal Register notice for comment, and used those principles to consider a wide range of species and focused on those 13 as being the most at risk.
Do you think that there's more on a species-specific basis that NOAA can do to help consumers make informed choices?
I would say there's probably always more that we can do. I don't, off the top of my head, know exactly what the next step to that would be, But as we engage and implement the seafood import monitoring program, what we are hoping to do is be able to learn from it. As we do it, we're looking at doing a better job at tracking the data and analyzing the data to learn some lessons from those products that do seem to be perhaps more at risk than the others within that process. And so I think that's an iterative process.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about how the European Union had a carding system that was used specifically with respect to Thailand to push that government to improve both fisheries management and other practices, labor rights, for example, that were very problematic? Have you considered that model for the United States?
We did consider that model when we were developing the seafood import monitoring program, and we decided that we wanted to focus on a country-by-country basis and that we focused on a certain type of criteria that we were looking at. I think the U.S. program and the EU program complement each other, and we sometimes find ourselves identifying the same countries and sometimes different countries, and they have both been very effective. The EU program is a resource-intensive, mission-based program where they spend a lot of time in country with countries that they have given a yellow card to, and we've seen them make some great strides, in particular with Thailand, as you noted.
All right. I have nothing further. The ranking member is welcome to do a second round if you'd like. There's no other questions, Ms. Cole, so we will thank you for your testimony, and I'll invite the next panel to come forward. While the next panel is coming forward, I'll go ahead and start introducing the witnesses that we're about to hear from. Our first witness is Mr. Ian Urbina, the author of The Outlaw Ocean, and also an investigative journalist for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and other publications. Next, we will hear from Ms. Ami Sagiv, and I understand you may be my constituent. Well, welcome to Washington. It's good to have you. Ms. Sagiv is the Senior Manager of Investments for Humanity United and lives in the most beautiful congressional district in America. Thank you for joining us. Following her, we will hear from Mr. Nathan Ricard, the Southern Shrimp Alliance's Trade Council. And then finally, our last witness will be Mr. John Connolly, President of the National Fisheries Institute. I think you heard me explain to the previous witness about the lights and the 5-minute limit, so I will dispense with that, and we will begin now by recognizing Mr. Urbina for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Ian Urbina, and until recently I've been an investigative reporter for the New York Times. 5 years ago, I began writing a series for the newspaper, which culminated in a just-published book called The Outlaw Ocean, about the diversity of environmental and human rights abuses occurring offshore around the world. Over the past several years, this reporting chronicled the story of a Cambodian migrant who had been shackled by the neck on a trawler, catching fish destined for American shelves. Captive at sea for 3 years, this Cambodian was a synecdoche of a wider problem known as sea slavery that ensnares tens of thousands of men and boys on fishing boats each year globally. Off the coast of South Africa, I shadowed a Tanzanian stowaway who, discovered at sea by an unwitting and angry crew, was set overboard on a makeshift dinghy and left to die in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles from land as a storm approached. This grim phenomena, known as rafting, has become a more common way to dispose of migrants and stowaways, especially in the wake of new rules imposed after September 11 and more recently anti-immigration policies that have raised penalties for captains who arrive in port with unplanned guests on board. In the North Atlantic, I joined the longest law enforcement chase in nautical history. A vigilante conservation group called Sea Shepherd was attempting what no government had been willing to do. That is, these advocates were trying to stop a ship that for nearly a decade had fished illegally and largely unobstructed in Antarctic waters, profiting to the tune of more than $67 million. Interpol had placed this illegal ship on its so-called purple list, which is essentially an arrest-on-site list, but no one with the authority or responsibility to act ever did so until this vigilante NGO decided to step up. While investigating offshore violence, I spent time on floating armories. These are surreal places, part bunkhouse, part weapons depots, that are meant to house private maritime security guards in international waters, just beyond the reach of local government prohibitions against unregistered arms or mercenaries. As the guards wait for their next deployment on ships passing through piracy-prone areas, they detailed for me how and why at sea murder can occur with impunity. We discussed a case I was investigating at the time in which an entire offshore slaughter of a half-dozen unarmed men was captured on a camera phone, footage that had been provided to me. And at the end of that footage, the culprits or witnesses posed for celebratory selfies. To this day, no one has been charged, or neither has a prosecution ever occurred against the captain who ordered those murders. So what does any of this have to do with IUU or NOAA? There are few remaining frontiers on our planet, but perhaps the wildest and least understood are the world's oceans. Too big to fully police, and under no clear international authority, these immense expanses of water play host to rampant criminality and exploitation. This watery Wild West, which happens to cover 2/3 of the globe, is home to an assortment of extra-legal actors. They range from traffickers and smugglers, pirates and mercenaries, wreck thieves and repo men, to vigilante conservationists, elusive poachers, sea-bound abortion providers, clandestine oil dumpers, shackled slaves, and cast-adrift stowaways. Many of these actors flourish in the absence of governance, and importantly, many of the more urgent problems they are countering or creating involve an interplay between human rights and environmental abuses. In your discussion today, I'd submit to you 3 suggestions. First, the biggest problem is not a lack of law, but rather a lack of enforcement. The prerequisite of true enforcement is almost always monitoring. Think here of mandatory crew manifests, independent vessel identification numbers, VMS and AIS or other vessel tracking, port state inspection regimes, supply chain auditing, barcode fish tracking, onboard cameras, comprehensive blacklists of scofflaw vessels, government-funded satellite monitoring. In other words, solutions exist if only we are willing to apply them. Second, in pondering solutions to IUU, it would be perilous, in my view, to ignore the way that environmental abuses contribute to and derive from human rights and labor crimes. My point here is that we need to think not just of the fish, but also of the fishers. The definition of illegal fishing should take into account not just whether the catch was pulled from forbidden waters using prohibited gear, for example, but whether the people doing the work were debt bonded, beaten, trafficked, or ever paid. Finally, and here I know I do not need to tell any of you this, the time for action is now. When it comes to this woefully out of sight, out of mind realm, what has most often been missing is not policy ideas, but the political will to apply them. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Urbina. Ms. Sagib, you're welcome to the committee and recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McClintock, and distinguished members of subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing today and for the opportunity to testify. I'm pleased to represent Humanity United and our partners around the world who work every day to combat forced labor and human trafficking in the seafood sector. Humanity United is a nonpartisan foundation dedicated to cultivating the conditions that transform human exploitation and violent conflict into enduring freedom and peace. This hearing is an important opportunity to highlight the human cost of IUU fishing, and we welcome this subcommittee's attention to NOAA's report. We were particularly pleased to see the section of the report on forced labor and human trafficking. In the United States, we are not shielded from the issues of forced labor or human trafficking in our seafood purchases. On the contrary, the overwhelming majority of our seafood is imported or re-imported after processing, almost guaranteeing that we are consuming seafood produced by IUU or forced labor somewhere along that journey. This is not a problem that we are distanced from. It is in our everyday. Since 2010, Humanity United has worked to disrupt the system of exploitation in seafood supply chains with particular emphasis on Thailand. We provide funding for investigative journalism, civil society groups, technical assistance to government, capacity building to businesses aiming to improve their practices, and direct advocacy. We were also privileged to support the development of my fellow witness, Ian Ravina's new book. Environmental and labor abuses in the seafood industry are intractable, complex problems that mutually enable and reinforce one another. Even in a world that is divided on many issues, we can all agree that we do not want human trafficking in our seafood any more than we want to see our precious marine resources degraded and reduced to nothing. In recent decades, we have seen overfishing quickly deplete fish stocks forcing boats to fish further and further from shore, raising their fixed costs, and incentivizing a reliance on illegal practices, both environmental and labor. Regulation and oversight of this rapidly industrialized fleet is made all the more complicated by the fact that seafood supply chains are long, opaque, and highly distributed. Seafood passes through many hands before it finally arrives at our local grocer. Where industry oversight and governance are low, the ability and incentives to cut corners on ethical labor practices or to overlook environmental abuses is high. Regulation and penalties, however, can't be limited only to supplying countries or producers if we fundamentally want to shift this dynamic. These problems involve the entire supply chain. Retail and consumer demand for cheap seafood is part of creating producer incentives to engage in IUU and labor abuse. U.S. supermarkets must also examine their buying practices and adapt to changes in the supply chain. Addressing labor abuses in seafood production is an imperative, as it is pervasive across the industry. In fact, experts argue that forced labor in fishing is the prevalent norm, the standard staffing model for fishing vessels. Consequently, it is often the most vulnerable workers who are willing to take their chances on board a fishing vessel. The result is that a large proportion of workers in fishing are migrants, and the unfortunate fact is that many of these workers are trapped in debt bondage, forced to work in horrific conditions on vessels sequestered far out at sea for extended periods of time. Thailand serves as a good microcosm for understanding how the intersection of human trafficking and environmental abuses plays out in practice in a specific geography. Thailand was, for many years, the third largest exporter of seafood in the world, but its overfishing caused near-shore fish stocks to dwindle. Boats were forced to fish further from shore, exacerbating already complex supply chains and increasing the likelihood of illegal fishing. With an exploitable labor force, Thai vessels were able to continue to fish at the same unsustainable levels as before, maintaining profitability by relying on the de facto subsidy of forced labor. Thailand has demonstrated great leadership in making industry reforms, particularly over the opposition of powerful business interests. Significant challenges remain, however. Strong implementation remains elusive. Cooperation between forward-leaning government officials, industry leaders, and civil society will remain critical components to ongoing improvements. In closing, I just want to bring us back to the fact that environmental and labor issues are inextricably linked. The drivers and solutions to one are intricately bound with the drivers and solutions to the other. The issues surrounding forced labor and IUU must be addressed in tandem, otherwise we will most certainly fail to address either over the long term. I want to note that we are all part of these supply chains. When we sit down to eat, we cannot forget the millions of workers who catch and produce our food. It has been extremely encouraging to see examples of civil society, business, and the federal government recognizing the need to tackle these issues together, including NOAA acknowledging the need to address forced labor and human trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee for all the work you have done to ensure that the U.S. government continues to be a leader in the fight to end IUU and human trafficking in our food supply and across the globe. And thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you. Mr. Rickers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here this afternoon. I am Nathan Rickard, a partner at the law firm of Picard, Kenson Rowe, and trade counsel of the Southern Shrimp Alliance. The Southern Shrimp Alliance is a nonprofit association that represents the U.S. commercial warm water shrimp fishery operating from Texas to North Carolina. Its members are small and medium-sized family-owned and operated businesses located near the Gulf of Mexico and the South Atlantic. The executive director, John Williams, the president, Steve Bosarge, and each of the officers and directors of the Southern Shrimp Alliance are lifelong commercial fishermen. In contrast, I am a trade lawyer, and I am the least interesting person associated with that group. Nevertheless, I am here today on behalf of the organization to advocate for the increased use of border measures to further the policy goal of improving international fisheries management. Roughly 2 decades ago, massive amounts of cheap imported shrimp flooded our market. Prices for both domestic and imported shrimp went into free fall, and hundreds of shrimp fishermen were forced out of the industry. In response, the Southern Shrimp Alliance was formed in 2002. Through their organizing efforts, anti-dumping duty orders were issued in February of 2005. The following decade was characterized by a remarkably stable U.S. shrimp market. Between 2005 and 2014, the total volume of shrimp imports increased by just 9%, while the average unit values of those imports had increased by almost 71%, from $3.20 per pound to $5.46 per pound. The market stability was vital for the economic recovery of the domestic shrimp fishery. Although the industry had permanently lost many shrimping families and has struggled to maintain its foothold in some coastal communities, the threat that the industry would entirely disappear has abated. The U.S. shrimp industry currently produces about 1 out of every 8 pounds of shrimp that's consumed in our country. The commercial value of shrimp landings in the Gulf and South Atlantic is around $500 million each year, and these landings generate billions of dollars in economic activity throughout the South. The anti-dumping duties worked as designed and prevented future floods of cheap imports from wiping out the market. However, over the last 5 years, the market has changed again. Shrimp import volumes have increased by 22%, while import AUVs have fallen by 24%. These deteriorating market conditions are due to India, as Indian exports have exploded in the U.S. market, along with massive expansions in Indian shrimp aquaculture and increasing export subsidies granted to the shrimp industry by the Indian government. But even with those factors, what has happened in the U.S. market is unique. The United States and the European Union represent 2 of the 3 largest markets for seafood in the world. Yet while our imports of Indian shrimp have more than doubled in volume since 2014, the EU's imports of Indian shrimp have actually declined over that same time period. This is because following repeated detection of banned antibiotics in Indian shrimp, the EU has mandated 50% of all shrimp shipments from India be tested for veterinary drug residues and has imposed strict pre-shipment controls on Indian imports. On the other hand, the FDA samples 0.1% of seafood shipments to test for antibiotics. Not 10, not 1, but 0.1%. In result, we see large volumes of potentially contaminated Indian shrimp redirected to this market at low and decreasing prices. From these experiences, the Southern Shrimp Alliance has drawn 2 lessons. First, border measures work and can accomplish policy objectives with minimal adverse impacts on U.S. consumers. Second, when other major seafood importing markets impose border measures in furtherance of policy objective, and the United States does not, the seafood at issue will be rerouted to this market. Congress has instructed NOAA fisheries to utilize border measures to improve international fisheries management and to counter IUU fishing. The agency must be encouraged to use those tools and to report to this committee its progress in doing so. In the one specific instance that the agency has cited trade statistics in this report related to the IUU fishing of red snapper and the U.S. EEZ by Mexican nationals, the facts are not encouraging. Although NOAA documents continued, persistent, and growing violations, we are importing even more Mexican snapper, providing direct financial rewards for this behavior. For the shrimp industry, this IUU fishing directly undermines the actions the industry has taken to safeguard the red snapper stock and to rebuild Kemp's Ridley turtle populations in the Gulf of Mexico. Finally, the Southern Shrimp Alliance believes that NOAA has improperly omitted the use of slave labor from its understanding of IUU fishing. The agency intends to take regulatory action to expand the definition of IUU fishing and should use that opportunity to include the use of slave, forced, or child labor. Doing so would increase the agency's capacity to counter forced labor in seafood supply chains and is fully consistent with the discretion granted to NOAA fisheries to address all forms of IUU fishing. Thank you again for inviting me to share the U.S. shrimp industry's experience with trade in seafood, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Welcome to the committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock, for the opportunity to discuss the issue of pirate fishing with you. My oral comments will highlight 6 issues very briefly. First, NOAA Fisheries operates a system that is science-based, transparent, and inclusive. It is also highly successful in ensuring our marine resources are available now and in the future. It is successful, though, because it is focused and it has not been distracted by other tasks. Second, the biennial report enables Congress to assist NOAA Fisheries in addressing situations in which the agency found specific countries to be complicit in IUU. Rather than indiscriminately adding costs to nations that manage fisheries well, costs that do not come with sustainability benefits, the report should help the U.S. government to focus its effort on those countries that need to improve, as the Chair and Ranking Member have noted in their opening comments. Third, the Seafood Import Monitoring Program has not been a success. To the foundation of the program, the 2014 Premod Pitcher paper and its methodology to estimate IUU in the U.S. market has largely been debunked. Specifically, when the authors replicated the methodology for a 2017 paper to estimate illegally caught U.S. pollock entering the Japanese market, experts reacted. After Premod et al. Had to retract their initial paper, in 2019, leading global scientists, including Chris Oliver, head of NOAA Fisheries, Dr. Iannelli, the leading scientist in Alaska, and David Agnew, the head of Camelar, wrote a paper that concluded, in referencing the Premod Pitcher work, deficiencies in estimates of IUU in Alaska must cast serious doubts on the author's approach in all fisheries. To implementation, according to a senior NOAA official, after hundreds of thousands of entries under SIMP, in more than 1,000 SIMP audits, only 50 situations have been referenced to the Office of Law Enforcement at NOAA for further review. Of those, none, he reported, 0, he reported, have resulted in enforcement actions by DOJ. Those results call into question the effectiveness of the program, and it certainly gives pause to any calls for expansion of the program. Turning to fraud, does it occur? Yes, but as highlighted in the biennial report, fraud typically occurs when domestic packers run out of domestic product and turn to imported product. Should this be prosecuted? Absolutely. Does SIMP help this situation? Absolutely not. Fourth, NFI abhors any abuse of men or women working in the seafood sector. In those cases where it has been credibly alleged, we have worked with the supply chain to address it. We have also worked with governments and non-governmental organizations on needed policy changes in various countries to address this challenge. And we have worked with investigative NGOs and the media to highlight the issue. Fishing, as has been well written, is dirty, dangerous, and difficult. We reject, though, the claim that forced labor in the seafood industry is the norm. Today, tens of thousands of men and women are catching fish that will end up in the restaurants that you enjoy or the dinners that you cook with your family, and they feel great pride in that work. Fifth, the U.S. government has multiple agencies and initiatives designed to combat human trafficking and forced labor. The State Department Tip Office, in its annual report, the requirement for Department of Labor to publish country product pairings of forced or child labor, and Customs withhold release orders are 3 prominent examples. Adding the responsibility for labor to NOAA seems like adding a 4th stop sign on the same residential street. If the cops at state or at labor or at Customs are not prosecuting these offenders, what suggests NOAA has the capability to do that? Sixth, that in closing, there's a Silesian saying, be who you are and be that well. Our advice is to let NOAA continue to focus on what it does well and who they are, excellent managers of marine resources. As attractive as it is to add the new challenge of labor to NOAA, they are simply not the right agency to deal with this problem. Let others who have the experience and expertise take that job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize myself for the first 5 minutes of questioning, and I'd like to start with you, Ms. Segev. We have heard the argument that NOAA and others should simply let this industry self-regulate to address many of the problems that have been discussed today. And while I certainly agree there's many thoughtful and well-intended players in the industry, there's still a lot of incentive to cheat the system by importing inferior, mislabeled, and illegal harvested products. And so I want to ask you to speak to some of the traceability measures that you think we could implement in order to ensure that imported seafood is what it's purported to be and is also not the product of forced labor and other abuses.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Huffman. As I've mentioned, these supply chains are long and opaque and distributed, and certainly, our work in seafood has shown us that it takes a spectrum of actors and interventions to manage these very complex problems. We very much see progress being made on the part of businesses, but we also very much feel that government has an extremely important role to play. At the end of the day, these issues in IUU and forced labor are crimes, and they need to be, the full extent of your authorities and NOAA's authorities need to be used to enforce those laws and regulations. Some of the recommendations we put forward do involve strengthening SIMP, including better resourcing, and looking at that IUU definition to give them the strongest mandate possible.
There's also been discussion of the EU's carding system, the yellow card, red card, and how that successfully led to changes regarding Thailand. Can you briefly explain how that system works and how it's different from the way we've been approaching this in the United States?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that the carding system in Thailand, and the EU's carding system in particular, the way it was applied to Thailand, was one of the biggest factors for all of the reform to the legal and regulatory framework there, and to much of the business response. The EU also worked closely with Thailand and provided a lot of oversight and accompaniment in those changes. And I think that there is definitely the capacity within NOAA to do the same with their process.
Okay.
The proper resourcing.
Mr. Ricard, I want to ask you about enforcement. And it seems that when we want to get tough, we can. And I want to specifically reference a situation, Trade and Travel Report by the Customs and Borders Protection Agency explains that in fiscal year 2018, they stopped 14 shipments of Chinese seafood valued at $1.2 million, bound for the United States market, because it was processed in facilities using North Korean nationals, a violation of sanctions. Why have we been able to prevent seafood produced by North Korean workers against our sanctions from entering into our market, but we haven't had similar success in preventing the importation of seafood harvested through IUU fishing or forced or slave labor or some of these other abusive situations we've been discussing today?
Thank you, Chairman. I think that a big part of that goes to the concept of the different federal agencies that are all working on this particular issue. As Mr. Connolly indicated, there are a bunch of different agencies that are working on stuff. They are not cops. The Department of Labor lists products that are produced through forced or child labor, and it lets the market know that there are risks with those particular supply chains. The issue has been for Customs and Border Protection enforcing the forced labor provisions of 1307, not having expertise in seafood supply chains, and they have been trying to get to that. That 1307 authority of preventing goods produced from forced labor, the agency since 1953 has imposed a total of 13 withhold release orders on non-Chinese products. That's it. That's all they've been able to do. They've done one this year on seafood products on a vessel called the Tanago 61 for activities that appear to have occurred in 2016. But they desperately would like to have the expertise of NOAA in understanding the supply chains and how they track and can counteract things. And I think that's why it's very important to have NOAA involved in this conversation.
All right, thank you. I yield back and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly, Ms. Gibbs' testimony states that when we buy seafood that's not caught and processed in the U.S., it's almost guaranteed that we're consuming seafood produced by IUU or forced labor. Do you find that statement to be accurate?
No, I don't. Are there pockets of problems in IUU? Absolutely. I think the biennial report indicates that. But we don't think it's pervasive of the norm. Are there pockets of labor that need to be addressed and fixed by the multitude of people that she referenced? Government, industry, NGOs, et cetera, absolutely. But it is absolutely not the norm that the seafood industry uses slave labor as some kind of workforce. And so the concept that it is guaranteed that Americans eating fish tonight or enjoying fish tonight are the result of slave labor, that's absolutely wrong.
Okay, you mentioned in your testimony that the National Fisheries Institute's done significant analysis on the cost and impacts of SIM. What did you come up with, and how did you get those numbers?
Our estimate was it would cost $53 million to implement the broker and data entry aspects of this. And then there's much higher cost in the actual audits that are required to back up all the paperwork that's required. So companies need to hold 2 years worth of paper of every shipment of every harvest that's done. So for instance, an Icelandic cod vessel goes out. These are not big trawlers. These are kind of father and son, father and daughter operations. They go out and catch some fish, and to fill up a 40,000-pound container takes hundreds of these harvest events.
And just to be clear, this small fishing vessel, they do not use forced labor. They are obeying all of the laws. They are doing everything by the book, correct?
Yes, in the case of Iceland, they are so committed to well-run fisheries that every coin in Iceland has a fish on it. That's a country that cares fairly deeply about their fish.
Well, and yet these fishermen have to go through what in order to comply with the law?
They need to keep records that will end up going down the supply chain and ultimately being kept by an importer for 2 years. And that's where there's very significant costs above the $53 million reside, and then get passed on to the consumer.
And who bears those costs?
Ultimately, the consumers bear the costs.
Okay, and what does this accomplish exactly?
Well, when we talked to the senior NOAA official about this at a public meeting, he went through 1,000 audits, 50 referred to Office of Law Enforcement, and 0 ended up at DOJ for enforcement. So we frankly don't think that SIMP has been successful at all. We think the report, the best use of this report is to bring the whole of government effort to those countries that have been identified as having a problem, and don't whack the countries that don't have a problem. There are countries that have outstanding fisheries management systems, outstanding systems, and yet we make them bear the same costs as those countries that the report says needs improvement. I think you and the chair both said focus the resources where it needs to be done. We would very much agree with that.
What changes would you make to the current regulations?
Well, I don't think it's a secret for many that we sued to actually get rid of this regulation and unfortunately lost. We think going back to the purpose of the biennial report, which was to highlight where there are problems with IUU, we think focusing all of the government's efforts, whether it be state, whether it be USAID, whether it be NOAA's bilateral work that they do with these countries, that's where we can make the most difference. But don't whack and don't incur costs throughout the supply chain where it's not going to make any difference. You're not going to improve sustainability in Icelandic cod.
And to be clear, you represent all sectors of the American fishing industry, correct?
We're a water-to-table organization. We represent Alaska harvesters, Alaska processors. So if you have seen the show Deadliest Catch, those boat owners are our members. When they pull into Dutch Harbor, those companies are our members.
These
we also represent
are
importers.
American entrepreneurs, American workers who are playing by all the rules, who are obeying all the laws, who are doing everything by the book, and they're the ones being penalized by these regulations.
We think that the balancing out and ensuring that others play by the same rules as the U.S. is an important part of the responsibility that NOAA has, as evidenced by the biennial report and the work that Congress
Is there anything else that you'd want to add to what's been said by the other witnesses?
No, I think the time's up, so we'll answer other questions as appropriate.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Huffman, and for conducting this, I think, very important meeting. I think, sir, it's crucial that we talk about IUU fishing in this committee, because as one of our witnesses, Mr. Urbina, mentioned in his testimony, we got to think about the men and the women on the water and not just the fish. There are almost 25 million people in forced labor around the world, according to the International Labor Organization. 11% of that forced labor is in agriculture and the fishing sectors. The State Department, I think, identified over 50 countries with human trafficking just within its seafood supply chain. The United States is one of the top seafood importers in the world, and as such, I think we bear a responsibility for this very disturbing reality. Let me begin. Mr. Urbina, with your experience aboard some of these fishing vessels and the other accumulated experience, you certainly have a personal perspective. In your view, what role does the United States have in combating the human rights abuses associated with forced labor in the seafood supply chain?
Thank you for the question. I think the U.S. has a huge role to play, both in setting an example to the world and how a supply chain should be handled. I guess I would also point out that it's important in thinking about these issues to be careful about which boats we're talking about and what portion of U.S. or European consumption comes from American or Icelandic boats versus Thai, Cambodian, Chinese, Taiwanese, Korean. If we're going to talk about labor conditions and concerns about sea slavery, we should probably be looking at the right kinds of boats and also the boats that are contributing the largest portion of the fish that are ending up in EU and American markets, and not the smaller, better-run boats that probably don't have slave labor conditions. So I think that's an important distinction to bear in mind. But I do believe that in the current reality, our supply chain, our consumption chain, is heavily tainted with these sorts of labor conditions, largely because of the vessels the countries that I just cited.
Thank you. Ms. Seguia, how pervasive is the labor conditions, the forced labor in the seafood supply chain? And what's the likelihood, it was mentioned, that the U.S. and through its consumers, the rest of us, is importing seafood that comes from this forced,
Thank you. Thank you for the
for
question.
lack of a better word, slave labor?
Understood. Thank you for the question. Yeah, you know, as I mentioned in my testimony, the issues of IUU and labor are so inextricably linked. And so at a certain point, it becomes a math problem. As those fish stocks shrink, you know, these boats are competing for a smaller and smaller portion of the pie, and they have to make up those costs somewhere, and that cost comes out of labor. You know, there was just an article out today citing, you know, the top 6 countries on the IUU list are also some of the top exporters of seafood. And so, you know, these issues, as Ian's pointed out as well, are just pervasive, you know, across the industries. You know, we are fortunate in the U.S. to have good, sound, scientifically based fisheries management, but that is not the case everywhere. And that's why, again, the role of government oversight is so critical here, especially for the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ricard, the impacts of IUU fishing on the honest American fishers that you represented, you talk about impact, and can you describe that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'm not a fisherman, but I would say, I guess in response to something that Mr. Connolly said, that fishermen, the domestic fishermen, they do a lot of reporting on all the things that they're complaining about with respect to Icelandic fishermen. That is their reality, that they have to keep that paperwork and back on it. They have to adhere to the regulatory structure that the United States has put in place. They work within that system, and what they have been asked to do, not only just with IUU fishing, but with everything else, is compete with regulatory systems that are not equal. And where that comes into IUU fishing, it creates this economic cost for them in the marketplace that is very significant.
Thank you. I don't know what my time is.
You're the chairman. I mean, would you like some more?
No, I'm done. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cunningham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today with us from the 1st District of South Carolina. And down there, the low country fishermen play by the rules. They work hard. Folks like Taylor and Cindy Tarvin, who go out there and work tirelessly to bring back good quality shrimp on their vessel, the Miss Paula. They do it in an honest way. But, you know, the illegal fishing undercuts their ability to sell a high-quality product at a fair price to American consumers. And that's why I offered an amendment to the appropriations bill to commit additional resources to USAID's efforts to combat IUU fishing. Mr. Rickard, in your testimony, you described some of the controls that European Union has to prevent importation of inferior farmed shrimp products from India, which it tracks with the data showing Indian exports of shrimp to the U.S. on the rise, while the amount exported to the EU is declining. So, in essence, does this mean that we're feeding our families shrimp from India that isn't good enough for Europe when high-quality shrimp from South Carolina is available instead?
Congressman, I think that's correct. I think that's the right summary to draw, that when there is market or border measures in place in another country, that what the European Union has done is taken safeguards to ensure that shrimp that's contaminated with banned antibiotics does not enter their marketplace. In comparison, we have nothing that's similar to it. And I say that when we're talking about how pervasive fraud practices are in the world, that it is hard to argue against the significance of it when you just look at trade statistics. The second largest market for Indian exports is Vietnam, and that is not because Vietnam consumes a lot of Indian shrimp. It is because it has become a transshipment point for Vietnamese shrimp processors to send things out to the U.S. market. So not only are we getting stuff in from India directly that has been effectively high-graded so the stuff that's going to the European Union has been high-graded so it's not contaminated. We're getting things from there. And then even when the FDA takes action, we are still at large risks of taking in shrimp that has been banned from the United States from an FDA import alert that's coming in through Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. Rickett. I appreciate your time, and as well as everyone else testifying. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Sablan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I learned today that NOAA may actually be, and I do know that they have a tourism component, but I had also learned that they're also in the hospitality business, trying to be hospitable to nations despite that they are violating the law. Mr. Urbina, 5 countries, sir, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Spain are responsible for 90% of distant water fishing activity, especially in the waters of Pacific Island nations, East Africa, and West Africa, where there is a lower capacity for enforcement at sea. Chinese fleets are reported to make up about 40% of all distant water fleets in other countries, EEG. The Northern Mariana Islands and the island nations across Micronesia, an area that's equal in size to the 48 contiguous states, and the larger Pacific are particularly vulnerable to distant water fishing with thousands of square miles of open oceans in our EEG, and with 1 Coast Guard cutter to patrol the area. So what are some ways we can help enforce or help improve enforcement?
First of all, I agree with the premise of your question. I do think that the island nations are probably the front line of this fight, and the U.S. probably has an important role to play in moving out to that front line and solving these problems before they reach our shores. In my testimony, I listed, I think, a range of different tactics that I've heard over the years that could be imposed and reinforced, especially on that front line. I think the U.S. is already playing some role, the U.S. Coast Guard, in these ride-alongs and serving as advisors in many places, such as Palau, which is a place I know well. Also providing infrastructure, so boats, as well as training, satellite capabilities. Obviously, the U.S. is very strong in that arena and can play a bigger role in sharing some of that sort of monitoring capacity with these island nations.
Yeah, I do actually. I was in Palau at one time when Australia provided them with some equipment that would help them patrol their EEG, where, of course, as you may know, 80% of their EEG are conservation areas. Amazing country, nation. Ms. Saget, did I say that right? Your written testimony touches on the connections between labor abuses in the fishing industry and shark finning. Can you speak more to this, please?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, in my testimony, I mentioned that oftentimes laborers on boats who are already very often not getting paid a living wage are forced to become complicit in crimes like shark finning. I think Ian noted that in his travels as well. It's just a common issue that happens in certain fleets where, you know, workers are able able to make up their wages through these, becoming complicit in these illegal practices.
Yeah, and actually, with my colleague from Hawaii is not here at the moment, but there has been news reports in Hawaii Cebu Beach, I think, where fishing boats would come in and their crew are not allowed to get off the boat because they don't have a visa, or for whatever reasons they don't have passports, who knows. But thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I appreciate the inclusion in NOAA's latest IUU report of forced labor and human rights abuses in the fishing industry. But even with that inclusion, it's still at best an incomplete document. In the very brief section on forced labor, the report mentions that these issues are beyond the scope of this report. I personally disagree. Forced labor and human trafficking are fully within the scope of the report. You know, if that was considered with the full magnitude in this report, as it should be, I believe Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and possibly other countries would be identified as engaging in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So not only is this a human rights issue that we're talking about, but we're also talking about environmental and public health issues. I want to talk a little bit about following up on what Mr. Cunningham talked about in terms of food security. He talked about shrimp, you know, and what it was, and the importation of shrimp from India that is not allowed to go into the EU. I'll tell you a little story. I represent the largest, or one of the largest, if not the largest, Vietnamese American communities in Little Saigon in Orange County, California. And I hear from my constituents all the time. They do marches, they have rallies regarding the horrors of the Formosa chemical spill. I don't know if you're aware of it. In 2016, the Formosa steel plant in Vietnam, it was called the Formosa steel plant. It's not in Formosa, it's in Vietnam. And it's in coastal Vietnam. It leaked toxic chemicals waste, which resulted in a huge number of fish deaths. And the Vietnamese government announcing a ban on processing or selling of seafood caught within 20 nautical miles of the Vietnam provinces where this was capped. We know that traceability in the fishing industry in Vietnam is going to need improvement, but if we cannot or do not track fishing activities in this area, then we're not adequately tracking where these boats are fishing, which boats are engaged not only in forced labor practices, but contaminated fish, bringing in contaminated fish, as well as fish that has been caught by forced labor, and they can come into the U.S. market, and they come through my district. Not only the Vietnamese American section, but I represent the port area in the Long Beach, LA area, which is the largest importer of seafood from Asia, so they're coming into my district. So the questions that I have for Mr. Rickard to Mr. Urbina is that under Section 1307, the authority to stop the importation of goods produced through forced labor or forced or child labor, Customs and Border Protection now has issued a withhold release order on seafood that landed by the vessel, the fishing vessel called Tunago, number 61, and they blocked these goods from entering the country, but there's been no other orders issued on seafood imports. The question I have is, do you anticipate Customs and Border Patrol will issue additional withhold release orders on seafood products involving slave labor and possibly contaminated food in the supply chain in the future? How are we going to, is there a relation? Are we really do we know where fish that's coming from Vietnam was caught, really? And so I ask anyone on the panel about that wants to respond.
I'll start, Congressman. The two major fish exports in Vietnam are shrimp and pangasius, which is a sort of a catfish. Both of those are farmed products, and most of those are farmed inland. So we get very, very little wild capture product out of Vietnam. So in that sense, the farm product is unlikely to have the same kind of impact.
So you're saying that in the farm product, we're not really seeing any of the contamination which contaminated the entire coastal area of Vietnam?
We're unfamiliar with that, but would happen to follow up with your office. But we do not believe that there's any contamination in the shrimp farms or Pangasius farms as a result of that incident.
Sorry, just quickly, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has assigned somebody to be an issue area expert in their forced labor group on seafood issues. And one of the things that I think that we've taken from that is going to be very important for them is the availability of the data that NOAA is taking through the Seafood Import Monitoring Program to other federal agencies as they do enforcement to be able to track goods overall. And I think that from our perspective, the Seafood Import Monitoring Program has been wildly successful in the first 2 years that are in place. That the importers that we have worked with, that have shared with us the audit traces that have gone in place, have worked very well to help the federal agencies understand these very convoluted supply chains, and they're getting better at being able to trace those imports so that they can answer the questions that you have raised.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we will ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the committee, without objection, we stand adjourned.